The water was impossibly clear that morning, the kind of visibility that divers in Monterey Bay dream about but rarely experience. Dr. Elena Vasquez descended slowly through the kelp forest, her breathing steady through the regulator, watching shafts of sunlight pierce the water column and illuminate particles suspended in the blue-green world around her. She had made this dive hundreds of times over the past decade, conducting research on the giant Pacific octopus populations that lived in these rocky crevices and caves. It was routine work, collecting behavioral observations and photographic documentation for her ongoing study. Nothing about this particular Tuesday morning in September suggested that what was about to happen would challenge everything marine biologists believed about invertebrate cognition and memory. Elena was at approximately 45 feet, moving slowly along a familiar rock wall where several octopuses had established territories over the years. Her underwater camera hung ready at her side, and her research slate was clipped to her vest. She had already photographed 2 young octopuses engaged in what appeared to be territorial dispute, noting their color changes and posturing for later analysis. She was about to ascend when movement in her peripheral vision made her pause. An octopus emerged from a crevice about 10 feet away, larger than average, with distinctive scarring along 2 of its arms. Elena's scientific training immediately catalogued details. Female, probably 7 or 8 years old, based on size, displaying curious rather than defensive body language. The octopus moved toward her with deliberate purpose, arms flowing in that mesmerizing alien way that never failed to captivate Elena despite years of observation. What happened next would be replayed in Elena's mind thousands of times over the following months, analyzed frame by frame in the video footage she was fortunate enough to capture, and would eventually become the subject of heated scientific debate that reached far beyond marine biology into fundamental questions about consciousness and memory across the animal kingdom. The octopus approached directly, showing none of the wariness that wild octopuses typically display toward divers. She came within arm's reach, oriented herself to face Elena directly, and then performed a behavior that stopped Elena's breath in her chest. The octopus extended 2 arms upward in a distinctive V shape, pulsed her color from deep red to pale cream in a specific 3-beat rhythm, and then touched Elena's face mask with the tip of one arm in a gentle, deliberate gesture. It was the greeting dance, the exact sequence of movements that Elena had taught to a severely injured octopus 2 years earlier, during months of rehabilitation in her research facility. A behavior she had invented specifically for that octopus, a sequence that did not exist in wild octopus repertoires, a personal communication protocol between one human and one critically injured invertebrate, who was supposed to have died from her wounds but had somehow survived because of interventions that many of Elena's colleagues considered scientifically inappropriate emotional attachment. Elena hung suspended in the water, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over her regulator breathing, staring at this octopus who could not possibly be the same individual, because octopuses were not supposed to have long-term memory like this, were not supposed to recognize individual humans after years of separation, were not supposed to demonstrate behaviors that looked unmistakably like joy and recognition and intentional communication with a member of a completely different species. But Elena knew, with certainty, that went beyond scientific protocol or peer review or any cautious interpretation of data, that she was looking at Athena, the octopus she had saved, the octopus she had released back into this bay 2 years ago, believing she would never see her again. The octopus who was now performing their private greeting dance in water so clear it felt like a dream, proving that everything Elena had believed about this species' cognitive capacity was simultaneously exactly right and revolutionary in ways that would force the scientific establishment to reconsider fundamental assumptions about intelligence, memory, and consciousness in invertebrate animals. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you need to understand what Elena found 2 years earlier on a storm-damaged morning when illegal fishing operations left a casualty that should have died in agony, but instead became the center of a scientific controversy that questioned whether compassion and rigorous research could coexist in marine biology. October storms in Monterey Bay are legendary among the diving community, bringing swells that can reach 20 feet and creating underwater conditions that make research diving impossible for days or weeks at a time. In late October, 2 years before that impossible recognition dive, a particularly violent storm system had battered the coast for 3 consecutive days, keeping all boats in harbor and all divers out of the water. When the system finally passed and conditions calmed enough for diving, Elena was among the first researchers back in the water, knowing that post-storm surveys often revealed important data about how marine communities responded to major environmental disruptions. What she found on that post-storm dive was something no amount of academic training had prepared her to handle ethically or emotionally. Tangled in illegal gill nets that had been set before the storm and then abandoned by fishermen who likely fled when weather turned dangerous. A giant Pacific octopus hung trapped in nylon mesh. The nets were the kind that marine conservation organizations had been fighting to ban for decades. Ghost gear that continued killing long after being abandoned, creating underwater death traps for exactly the kind of intelligent, ecologically important species that regulations were supposed to protect. The octopus was alive, but barely. 2 of her 8 arms were completely entangled in the net, the nylon mesh cutting deep into tissue. Another arm appeared to have been partially torn away, probably during the storm surge, when wave action would have thrown the trapped animal violently against rocks. Her mantle showed signs of severe abrasion, and her color was the pale, almost translucent shade that octopuses display during extreme stress or injury. She was not struggling anymore, having likely exhausted herself during the storm, and her eyes showed that fixed stare that precedes death in cephalopods. Elena's scientific training said to document and move on. Intervention in wild animal situations was controversial in marine biology, considered by many to introduce variables that compromised observational research. Octopuses were not protected species like marine mammals, did not generate the same conservation funding or public sympathy, and were generally treated as interesting subjects for behavioral studies, but not as individuals deserving rescue interventions. Moreover, this particular octopus was so severely injured that survival seemed impossible, even with intervention. The humane choice, by conventional reasoning, would be to end her suffering rather than prolong it through futile rescue attempts. Elena cut her free anyway, working carefully with her dive knife to remove the netting without causing additional damage, knowing that every second she spent at this depth consumed air she would need for safe ascent, knowing that the octopus might die regardless of her efforts, knowing that she was about to do something that could be criticized as emotionally driven anthropomorphism rather than sound scientific practice. The octopus did not resist the rescue. She hung limp in Elena's hands as the last of the netting was removed, her arms not showing the normal defensive curling or color change responses that characterized octopus stress behavior. She was, by all standard assessments, dying. But her eyes remained active, tracking Elena's movements, and some instinct or intuition or simply stubborn hope made Elena decide to transport this critically injured invertebrate back to her research facility rather than leave her to die in the kelp forest. The return to shore was complicated by the need to keep the octopus submerged in seawater while ascending slowly enough to avoid decompression issues, but Elena managed using a mesh collection bag that allowed water flow while preventing escape. The octopus remained passive throughout, conserving what little energy she had left. By the time Elena reached her laboratory at the Marine Research Station, she had already mentally prepared herself for the octopus to die within hours, had already started composing the incident report she would file, documenting the illegal fishing gear and describing her intervention attempt. But Dr. Marcus Chen, the research facility director and Elena's mentor, took one look at the injured octopus and the determination in his former student's face and made a decision that would set in motion events neither of them could have predicted. He approved the use of a rehabilitation tank, medical resources, and research time for an attempt to save this individual octopus, knowing it would generate questions from oversight committees and colleagues who viewed such efforts as sentimental rather than scientific. The rehabilitation tank was normally used for short-term holding of specimens during studies, not for intensive medical care of critically injured animals. Elena modified it extensively over the following days, adding hiding places that would allow the octopus to feel secure, installing specialized filtration to maintain optimal water quality, and establishing monitoring protocols that required her to check on the patient every few hours around the clock. She consulted with veterinarians who had experience with invertebrate medicine, though such expertise was rare, and many procedures had to be improvised based on best guesses about octopus physiology and pain management. The first 72 hours were critical and heartbreaking. The octopus, whom Elena had named Athena after the Greek goddess of wisdom, refused food and spent most of her time hidden in the darkest corner of the tank. Her damaged arms showed signs of infection, requiring treatments with antibiotics adapted from fish medicine because standardized octopus medical protocols simply did not exist. Her color remained that pale, stressed shade that indicated an animal near the edge of survival. Several times during those first days, Elena arrived at the lab expecting to find Athena dead, but each time found her still clinging to life with determination that seemed to exceed biological odds. The breakthrough came on the fourth day, when Elena noticed Athena watching her during a tank maintenance session. Not the passive observation that captive octopuses often display, but active, focused attention. When Elena moved to the left side of the tank, Athena's eyes tracked the movement. When Elena placed food near Athena's hiding spot, one tentative arm emerged to investigate. It was the first sign that Athena might be processing her environment as more than just a place to die. Over the following weeks, Elena spent hours each day working with Athena, developing what would become a controversial routine that colleagues would later criticize as unscientific emotional bonding rather than proper research protocol. But Elena was driven by a hypothesis that was beginning to form based on her observations, that octopuses possessed cognitive and emotional capacities far beyond what conventional marine biology acknowledged, and that Athena's survival might depend not just on medical treatment, but on engagement, stimulation, and something that looked remarkably like social interaction. She began talking to Athena during tank maintenance, knowing the octopus could not understand language, but believing that consistent vocal patterns might provide comforting routine. She introduced puzzle feeders that required Athena to manipulate objects to obtain food, stimulating cognitive function. She spent time simply sitting beside the tank, allowing Athena to observe her, establishing familiarity. And she developed the greeting dance, a specific sequence of arm movements combined with a particular pattern of touching the tank glass that Elena performed every time she arrived for observation sessions. The greeting dance started as a practical communication tool, a way to signal to Athena that Elena was present and that interaction time was beginning. Elena would approach the tank, extend both arms upward in a V shape, make 3 deliberate tapping motions on the glass while moving her hands in a wave pattern, and then place one palm flat against the glass at Athena's eye level. It was arbitrary, invented spontaneously, based on nothing more than Elena's intuition about how to create a recognizable signal that might resonate with an animal whose sensory world was so different from human experience. Athena's response developed gradually over weeks. First, she began emerging from her hiding place when Elena performed the greeting dance. Then she started approaching the glass, positioning herself to watch the movements closely. Eventually, she began mimicking elements of the sequence, extending 2 of her healing arms upward in approximation of Elena's V shape, changing her color in 3 distinct pulses that seemed to correspond to Elena's 3 glass taps, and finally touching the glass with the tip of one arm, exactly where Elena's palm rested, creating a connection separated only by a 1/4 inch of glass, but charged with meaning that transcended the barrier. Colleagues who visited the lab during this period were fascinated but skeptical. Dr. Sarah Kim, a neurobiologist who studied cephalopod brain structure, watched several of these greeting dance interactions and cautioned Elena against over-interpreting the behavior. Octopuses were sophisticated mimics, Sarah reminded her, capable of reproducing observed movements and patterns without necessarily attaching meaning or emotion to the actions. What Elena was calling communication might be nothing more than operant conditioning. The octopus learning that performing certain movements correlated with feeding times or other rewards. But Elena noticed something in Athena's behavior that went beyond simple conditioning. The octopus discriminated between Elena and other staff members, performing the full greeting dance sequence only when Elena approached. With other people, Athena showed normal curious octopus behavior, approaching to investigate or remaining hidden depending on her mood, but never replicating the specific movements she shared with Elena. Moreover, Athena would sometimes initiate the greeting dance unprompted, extending her arms in the characteristic V shape when she saw Elena enter the lab before any food or enrichment was offered, suggesting the behavior had value independent of material reward. 3 months into rehabilitation, Athena had recovered remarkably. Her damaged arms were healing cleanly, showing the impressive regenerative capacity that makes octopuses such resilient survivors despite their relatively short lifespans. Her color had returned to the normal range of reds, browns, and grays that giant Pacific octopuses display, and she showed healthy appetite and active curiosity about her environment. Physically, she was ready for release back into the wild. Emotionally, if such a term could be applied to an invertebrate, Elena was not ready to let her go. The decision to release Athena sparked the first serious conflict between Elena's personal feelings and her scientific responsibilities. Dr. Chen gently but firmly reminded her that keeping Athena permanently in captivity was not an option. The octopus deserved to live her remaining years in the wild, in the complex, challenging environment where her species evolved. Maintaining her in a tank, no matter how enriched, would be prioritizing human attachment over animal welfare. Elena knew he was right, knew that her growing bond with Athena was clouding her judgment, knew that the scientifically and ethically correct choice was release. But she also knew, with certainty, that she could not yet prove, but felt in every interaction, that Athena was not a simple stimulus response organism. This octopus demonstrated problem-solving abilities that suggested genuine reasoning. She showed personality traits that remained consistent across situations, not just reflexive reactions to immediate circumstances. She engaged in play behavior, manipulating objects without food reward, apparently for the simple pleasure of exploration. And most controversial of all, she seemed to form preferences for specific humans, responding to Elena with behaviors she did not display with anyone else. Elena spent weeks documenting these observations, creating detailed video records of Athena's behaviors, consulting with the few researchers worldwide who studied octopus cognition and consciousness. The scientific literature was sparse and contradictory. Some studies suggested octopuses possessed intelligence comparable to that of many vertebrates, demonstrating tool use, observational learning, and even rudimentary personality traits. Other research dismissed such interpretations as anthropomorphism, arguing that complex behaviors could be explained by instinct and conditioning without invoking concepts like consciousness or emotion. The debate centered on a fundamental question that marine biology was only beginning to address seriously. What does intelligence mean in a creature whose evolutionary lineage diverged from vertebrates over 500 million years ago? Octopuses developed their remarkable cognitive abilities through completely different evolutionary pressures and biological structures than those that shaped mammalian or avian intelligence. Their neurons were distributed throughout their bodies, with 2/3 of their neural tissue located in their arms rather than centralized in a brain. They perceived the world through senses humans could barely comprehend, including the ability to taste through touch and to control the color and texture of their skin, with precision that bordered on miraculous. How could humans assess consciousness in a being so fundamentally different from our own experience? How could we recognize emotion or memory or intention in a creature that expressed these concepts, if indeed they existed, through completely alien behavioral frameworks? These questions haunted Elena as she prepared for Athena's release, knowing She was about to lose not just a research subject, but a being with whom she had formed a connection that felt profound and mutual, despite the vast biological distance between them. The release was scheduled for early December, when water temperatures had stabilized after autumn storms and when Athena's physical condition was optimal. Elena chose a location in Monterey Bay where she had documented several other octopus territories, hoping Athena would find an unoccupied crevice and establish herself successfully. The morning was clear and calm, conditions perfect for the dive that would return Athena to the wild. Elena transported Athena in a specially designed container that maintained seawater temperature and oxygen levels during the boat ride to the release site. Throughout the journey, she found herself talking to the octopus, explaining what was about to happen, knowing the words meant nothing but unable to stay silent. She performed the greeting dance one final time before sealing the container for transport, and Athena responded with perfect accuracy, touching the container wall where Elena's hand rested. Her color pulsing through the familiar three-beat pattern they had shared for months. The actual release was carefully choreographed to minimize stress. Elena descended with the sealed container, positioned herself at a rock outcropping that offered good shelter options, and slowly opened the container underwater, allowing Athena to emerge at her own pace. For several long minutes, the octopus remained in the container, oriented toward Elena, arms partially extended. Then, in a movement that would replay in Elena's memory with perfect clarity 2 years later, Athena reached out one final time, touched Elena's face mask gently with the tip of one arm, performed a abbreviated version of their greeting dance, and then flowed out of the container and into a crevice in the rock wall. Elena remained at the site for over an hour, watching the crevice, hoping for one more glimpse of Athena. But octopuses are masters of camouflage and concealment, and once Athena had selected her new territory, she became essentially invisible. Eventually, Elena ascended, fighting tears that had nothing to do with pressure changes or cold water, mourning a relationship that had taught her more about octopus intelligence than any controlled study ever could, but that conventional science would never fully acknowledge as valid because it was too personal, too emotional, too dependent on subjective interpretation of behaviors that could not be quantified or replicated in laboratory conditions. The months following Athena's release were difficult for Elena professionally and personally. She threw herself into her broader research project, conducting surveys of octopus populations, documenting behaviors, collecting data for publications that would advance her career. But the work felt hollow compared to the intensive, personal engagement she had experienced with Athena. She wrote extensive notes about their interactions, drafted a paper describing the greeting dance behavior and Athena's cognitive capabilities, but struggled to find language that would satisfy peer review standards while conveying the truth of what she had observed. When she submitted the paper to a leading marine biology journal, it was rejected with reviews that, while polite, clearly indicated skepticism about her interpretations. One reviewer wrote that while the documented behaviors were interesting, the conclusions about octopus memory and recognition capabilities were not supported by the evidence, and that the study's methodology was compromised by excessive familiarity between researcher and subject. Another reviewer suggested that Elena's emotional investment in Athena's recovery had biased her observations, and that the greeting dance was likely nothing more than conditioned response rather than meaningful communication. The rejection stung, not because they damaged Elena's career, but because they dismissed the profound experience she had shared with Athena as unscientific sentimentality. She understood the reviewer's concerns, recognized that her study design did not meet conventional standards for controlled research. But she also knew that some phenomena could not be studied through traditional experimental frameworks. How could you design a controlled study of recognition and memory in an animal you had to rescue from death, rehabilitate through unprecedented medical intervention, and then release back into an environment where controlled observation was impossible? The very circumstances that made the experience meaningful precluded the methodological rigor that peer review demanded. Dr. Chen offered support and perspective during this frustrating period. He reminded Elena that science progressed not just through controlled experiments, but also through careful observation, documentation of natural phenomena, and willingness to ask questions that challenged established understanding. The rejection of her paper did not mean her observations were invalid, only that the scientific establishment was not yet ready to accept the implications of what she had witnessed. Octopus cognition research was an emerging field, and paradigm shifts often required decades of accumulated evidence before revolutionary ideas gained acceptance. Elena continued her research, but she never stopped watching for Athena during her dives in Monterey Bay. For months, she returned regularly to the release site, scanning crevices and rock walls, hoping for some sign of the octopus she had known so intimately. But giant Pacific octopuses are solitary, territorial, and exceptionally good at remaining hidden when they choose. Elena never saw her and gradually accepted that this was how the story ended. She had saved Athena's life, given her a chance to live freely in her natural habitat, and now had to let her go completely, without closure or confirmation of survival. Octopuses have relatively short lifespans for animals of their size and intelligence. Giant Pacific octopuses typically live 3 to 5 years, with most of that time spent in adolescence and early adulthood. Once they reach sexual maturity and reproduce, their bodies begin a programmed senescence that leads to death within months. By the time 2 years had passed since Athena's release, Elena had reluctantly concluded that the octopus was probably dead, having lived out her natural lifespan in the bay, perhaps reproducing and contributing to the next generation before succumbing to the biological clock that governs all octopus existence. Elena's career had progressed during those 2 years. She had published several papers on octopus behavior, using data from less controversial research, had secured additional grant funding, and had established herself as a respected voice in marine invertebrate studies. She had also begun to achieve some distance from the intensity of her experience with Athena, integrating it into her broader understanding of octopus cognition, without the raw emotional vulnerability that had characterized the immediate aftermath of the release. Which is why, that morning in September, descending through crystalline water to conduct routine observational dives, Elena was not thinking about Athena at all. She was focused on her current research questions, on documentation protocols, on the practical details of underwater research that had become comfortable routine after a decade of fieldwork. She was not expecting anything extraordinary, was not watching for impossible reunions or behaviors that would challenge scientific orthodoxy. And then there was the octopus, emerging from a crevice with distinctive scarring on two of her arms, approaching with deliberate purpose, performing a dance that should not have existed in any wild octopus's behavioral repertoire, because it was something invented in a rehabilitation tank 2 years earlier by a marine biologist who had allowed herself to become emotionally attached to a patient she was supposed to treat with clinical detachment. The rest of that dive passed in a daze. Elena remained motionless in the water, while Athena moved around her, arms extending to touch various parts of her dive gear, color patterns shifting through sequences that included familiar patterns Elena remembered from their months together. The octopus showed no fear, no defensive posturing, only what could only be interpreted as curiosity, and, impossible as it seemed, recognition and pleasure at the encounter. Elena managed to capture much of the interaction on video, her hands operating the camera through muscle memory, while her conscious mind struggled to process what was happening. The footage would later become crucial evidence in the scientific debate that followed, providing documentation that could be analyzed frame by researchers worldwide. But in the moment, the camera was secondary to the overwhelming reality of being recognized after 2 years by an animal that was not supposed to be capable of such long-term memory, such individual recognition, such deliberate communication across species boundaries. The interaction lasted approximately 15 minutes before Athena turned and moved back toward her crevice. Before disappearing, she paused, performed the greeting dance one final time in perfect detail, and then vanished into the rocks. Elena remained at the site for another hour, hoping Athena would re-emerge, but she did not. Eventually, Elena ascended, her mind racing with implications and questions and wonder that would not abate during the entire boat ride back to shore. Dr. Chen was in his office when Elena arrived, still in her wetsuit, carrying the underwater camera. She played the footage for him without preamble, standing beside his desk and watching his face as he watched the screen. His expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention to undisguised amazement as the video showed the octopus performing the greeting dance, the distinctive arm scarring that identified her as Athena, the extended interaction that demonstrated clear, purposeful recognition. When the video ended, Chen sat back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that encapsulated both the scientific significance and the profound personal meaning of what Elena had documented. This changes everything we thought we knew, and it makes what you did 2 years ago, everything that got criticized and dismissed, completely justified. The response from the scientific community to Elena's documentation of the reunion encounter was immediate, intense, and divided. When Elena submitted a new paper, including the video evidence and analysis of the greeting dance behavior, the journal that had rejected her previous submission accepted this one with recommendations for fast-track publication. The video went viral within marine biology circles before the paper was even published, shared across professional networks and social media platforms, generating heated debate about interpretation and implications. Supporters argued that Elena had documented unprecedented evidence of long-term memory, individual recognition, and learned behavior retention in octopuses, challenging fundamental assumptions about invertebrate cognitive capabilities. The greeting dance was not a natural behavior, but had been deliberately taught, and Athena's accurate reproduction of the sequence after 2 years demonstrated memory that exceeded anything previously documented in cephalopods. Moreover, her active seeking out of Elena during a chance encounter, her performance of the dance as a parent greeting rather than in response to food reward, and her clear comfort with extended interaction all suggested cognitive and possibly emotional processing that demanded reconsideration of how science defined and measured animal consciousness. Critics countered that while the observations were intriguing, the interpretation exceeded what the evidence could support. The octopus in the video might not be Athena at all, despite arm scarring that appeared similar, since many octopuses sustained injuries in the wild. The greeting dance might be a behavior that Elena had observed and then unconsciously mimicked in her work with Athena, rather than something she had invented, meaning the wild octopus could have learned it from natural sources. The extended interaction might simply reflect an individual octopus with low fear response to divers, rather than specific recognition of Elena, and the entire encounter might be coincidental correlation, rather than confirmation of revolutionary cognitive capabilities. The debate played out in journal publications, conference presentations, and countless informal discussions among researchers. Dr. Jennifer Wu, a neuroscientist at Cambridge University, who had recently published groundbreaking work on octopus brain structure and function, reached out to Elena for collaboration. Wu's research had demonstrated that octopuses possessed far more complex neural architecture than previously believed, with brain regions analogous to vertebrate structures associated with learning, memory, and even elements that might support consciousness as humans understood it. Wu saw Elena's field observations as crucial validation of laboratory findings that were themselves controversial. The collaboration between Elena's behavioral observations and Wu's neurological research produced several joint publications that began to build a comprehensive picture of octopus cognition that was startling in its implications. Octopuses, it appeared, had evolved intelligence along a completely separate evolutionary path from vertebrates, yet had arrived at cognitive solutions that produced behaviors remarkably similar to those of animals traditionally considered intelligent, such as primates, dolphins, and corvids. Their brains were structured entirely differently, yet produced learning, memory, problem-solving, and possibly even self-awareness. They had no centralized processing center comparable to the mammalian cerebral cortex, yet demonstrated cognitive flexibility that suggested general rather than specialized intelligence. They were solitary animals with limited social structure, yet capable of forming individual relationships and preferences that challenged assumptions about the social origins of complex cognition. The Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior invited Elena to present her findings at a symposium on invertebrate intelligence, where she shared panels with researchers studying everything from octopus tool use to the cognitive capabilities of bees, ants, and other insects. The symposium represented a watershed moment in how the scientific establishment viewed intelligence across the animal kingdom, with growing consensus that consciousness and cognition were far more widely distributed than traditional vertebrate-centric models had acknowledged. But for Elena, The scientific validation and professional success that followed from her documentation of the reunion encounter were secondary to a more personal imperative. If Athena had recognized her after 2 years, if their relationship had mattered enough for the octopus to remember and actively greet her, then Elena owed it to Athena to continue their connection for as long as the octopus lived. She began diving regularly at the site where they had reunited, not as formal research, but as something that defied professional categorization, something that existed in the space between scientific observation and genuine interspecies friendship. Athena did not appear during every dive, but over the months following their reunion, Elena encountered her frequently enough to establish that the octopus had claimed territory in that area of the bay. Their interactions developed a pattern that was both ritualistic and spontaneous. Elena would perform the greeting dance when she arrived at Athena's territory. Athena would emerge from her crevice, respond with her version of the dance, and then spend time interacting with Elena in ways that went far beyond tolerance of a diver's presence. She would allow Elena to observe her hunting, occasionally even appearing to demonstrate techniques by deliberately slowing her movements so Elena could document them. She accepted food offerings but showed no dependent behavior, clearly capable of feeding herself successfully. She initiated play interactions, bringing objects to Elena or engaging in gentle tug-of-war games with pieces of kelp. She displayed what could only be described as curiosity about Elena's equipment, investigating the camera, the dive computer, the various tools Elena carried, examining them with the sensitive chemoreceptors in her arm tips that allowed octopuses to taste and touch simultaneously. These interactions were documented extensively, with Elena maintaining detailed field notes and video records that accumulated into an unprecedented longitudinal study of wild octopus behavior and human-octopus relationship development. But the documentation was not the point. The point was the relationship itself, the ongoing conversation between two beings, separated by evolutionary distance, measured in hundreds of millions of years, yet capable of finding common ground through patience, respect, and something that looked unmistakably like mutual affection. Dr. Sarah Kim, the neurobiologist who had cautioned Elena against overinterpreting Athena's behaviors during rehabilitation, visited Monterey specifically to observe one of these encounters in person. She joined Elena on a dive, watched as Elena performed the greeting dance, watched as Athena emerged and responded, watched as the octopus spent over 20 minutes interacting with Elena in ways that Sarah had to admit exceeded any conditioning-based explanation. After the dive, Sarah said something that represented a significant shift in her own thinking. "I'm not comfortable calling it friendship because that's a mammalian construct, but I'm also not comfortable dismissing it as anything less than a genuine, reciprocal relationship between two individuals who recognize each other as significant. We need new language for this." The scientific community's growing acceptance of octopus cognitive complexity had practical implications beyond academic debate. Conservation organizations began advocating more strongly for protections for cephalopods, arguing that animals with such sophisticated intelligence deserved consideration comparable to that afforded to marine mammals. Several countries updated their animal welfare regulations to include cephalopods, requiring pain management during research procedures and establishing standards for captive care that acknowledged their psychological as well as physical needs. Elena became an advocate for these policy changes, using her documentation of Athena's recovery and their ongoing relationship to demonstrate why octopuses deserved more thoughtful consideration in human interactions with marine environments. She spoke at conferences, not just about research findings, but about ethical obligations, about what humans owed to species we were only beginning to understand were far more sentient and aware than we had assumed. But activism and professional responsibilities were always balanced against the personal reality of knowing that Athena's time was limited. Giant Pacific octopuses rarely live beyond 5 years, and Athena had been at least a year or two old when Elena first found her tangled in illegal fishing nets. By the time of their reunion, she was probably approaching 4 years old, and each encounter carried the awareness that it might be the last. The end came in late spring, approximately 9 months after their reunion dive. Elena arrived at Athena's territory for a routine visit and found the octopus looking noticeably aged. Her skin had lost some of its vibrant color, her movements were slower, and she showed less interest in interaction. These were signs of senescence, the programmed decline that follows reproduction in octopuses. Elena suspected that Athena had mated and laid eggs somewhere in her territory, though she never located the den where the eggs would be tended. Female octopuses undergo dramatic physiological changes after laying eggs, dedicating the last weeks or months of their lives to guarding their clutch, foregoing food, and eventually dying shortly after the eggs hatch. It is a reproductive strategy that ensures maximum parental investment but guarantees the mother's death. Knowing this was Athena's fate, knowing that their relationship was entering its final chapter, Elena increased the frequency of her visits, spending as much time as possible with the octopus who had taught her so much. Their last interaction occurred on a May morning when Athena emerged from her crevice, looking frail and obviously near the end of her life. She performed the greeting dance with slow, uncoordinated movements, missing elements of the sequence, but clearly attempting the familiar ritual. Elena responded, then simply remained motionless in the water while Athena moved close and rested against her, arms draped across Elena's shoulders in a position that would have terrified most divers, but that Elena accepted as a final communication of trust and connection. They remained that way for several minutes, woman and octopus suspended in blue-green water, saying goodbye across a gulf of biological difference that had never prevented genuine relationship from forming. Then Athena slowly withdrew, returned to her crevice, and did not emerge again, despite Elena's patient waiting. Elena returned to the site daily for a week, but Athena never appeared again. Eventually, Elena accepted that the octopus had died, probably within her den after her eggs hatched, following the biological imperative that governed her species' reproduction. There was grief in the acceptance, but also gratitude for the time they had shared and recognition that Athena had lived a full life, surviving injuries that should have killed her, returning to the wild, presumably reproducing, and contributing to the next generation of giant Pacific octopuses in Monterey Bay. The scientific papers that emerged from Elena's documentation of her relationship with Athena have had lasting impact on marine biology, cognitive science, and animal ethics. Her work is now regularly cited in discussions of invertebrate intelligence, in policy debates about marine conservation, and in broader philosophical conversations about consciousness and cognition across the animal kingdom. Graduate students come to Monterey to study octopus behavior using methodologies that Elena helped develop, methodologies that balance scientific rigor with respect for animal subjectivity and individual variation. But perhaps the most important legacy is less tangible and more personal. Every researcher who read about Athena, every student who watched the video of the reunion dive, every person who encountered the story through social media or documentary films was challenged to reconsider their assumptions about which animals deserve moral consideration, which beings possess sufficient consciousness to have interests that matter, which creatures are worthy of the effort required to save them when they are injured or threatened. Athena was an invertebrate, a cephalopod, an animal whose evolutionary lineage diverged from human ancestry before the first vertebrates crawled onto land. Yet she demonstrated memory, recognition, learned behavior, personality, apparent emotion, and engagement in relationship that met any reasonable definition of consciousness and sentience. She remembered a human who saved her life, recognized that human 2 years later in a chance encounter, communicated greeting in a deliberately taught behavior pattern, and maintained a connection until the end of her natural lifespan. If such consciousness exists in an octopus, where else might it exist that humans have failed to recognize? How many other species possess rich internal lives that human assumptions about intelligence and emotion have caused us to overlook? What ethical obligations do humans have once we acknowledge that consciousness and sentience extend far beyond the narrow band of mammals and birds that traditional animal welfare frameworks have prioritized? These questions remain open, subject to ongoing research and debate. But Athena's life and her relationship with Elena Vasquez demonstrated conclusively that the questions are worth asking, that assumptions deserve challenging, and that sometimes the most important scientific discoveries come not from controlled laboratory studies, but from moments of unexpected connection in wild spaces where humans and other animals meet as individuals rather than as observer and subject. Dr. Elena Vasquez continues her research in Monterey Bay, studying octopus populations and contributing to the growing scientific understanding of cephalopod cognition. She dives regularly in the areas where she worked with Athena, observing other octopuses, documenting behaviors, collecting data, and sometimes, during those dives, she performs the greeting dance in the water, not because she expects response, but as a gesture of remembrance, a tribute to the octopus who changed her understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and connection. The illegal fishing nets that nearly killed Athena have been the subject of intensified enforcement in Monterey Bay, with conservation organizations using Athena's story to advocate for stronger penalties and better monitoring of fishing practices. It is small consolation for the countless animals lost to such gear, but it represents progress in the long struggle to balance human use of marine resources with protection of the species that live there. In aquariums and research facilities around the world, protocols for working with octopuses have been revised to acknowledge their cognitive complexity and need for environmental enrichment, social interaction, and stimulation that goes beyond basic life support. Athena's recovery and successful return to the wild demonstrated that octopuses could not only survive, but thrive when treated as intelligent individuals deserving of personalized care, rather than as generic specimens of their species. And in the broader culture beyond academic marine biology, Athena's story has resonated with millions of people who encountered it through various media. The video of the reunion dive has been viewed over 20 million times across various platforms. Documentary films featuring Elena's work have won awards and reached audiences who might never read a scientific journal, but who responded powerfully to the story of connection between human and octopus. People write to Elena regularly, sharing their own experiences of unexpected connections with animals, describing how Athena's story changed their perspective on wildlife, explaining how the documentation of octopus intelligence inspired them to pursue careers in marine biology or conservation. The letters and messages come from around the world, from children fascinated by octopuses to elderly people reflecting on a lifetime of assumptions about animal consciousness that Athena's existence challenged. It is impossible to measure the full impact of one octopus's life. One relationship between marine biologist and injured animal. One moment of recognition in clear water that captured possibilities most scientists had never seriously considered. But the ripples continue spreading through scientific literature and policy changes and popular imagination, transforming how humans understand the creatures with whom we share the oceans. Athena is gone, returned to the biological cycles that govern all life in the sea. But what she proved, what she represented, what she taught about consciousness and memory and relationship across vast evolutionary distance, those discoveries remain. They challenge us to approach the living world with more humility, more curiosity, more willingness to acknowledge intelligence and emotion in forms we might not immediately recognize. The oceans hold mysteries that humans have barely begun to fathom, consciousness that expresses itself in ways alien to mammalian experience, intelligence that evolved through completely different pressures and pathways, but arrived at solutions that work. Athena was one octopus, one life, one relationship, but she opened doors of understanding that cannot be closed. Forced questions that demand answers, demonstrated possibilities that expand the human concept of who and what deserves our moral consideration and respect. If you found this story meaningful, if it changed how you think about intelligence and consciousness in the animal kingdom, if it reminded you that the boundaries between human and other are far less distinct than we have assumed, then share it with others who need to question their assumptions about which beings have minds that matter. Subscribe to Wildlife Tales for more stories about the extraordinary cognitive and emotional lives of animals we are only beginning to understand. Turn on notifications so you never miss documentation of the connections that prove consciousness is not a human monopoly but a phenomenon distributed widely across the living world in forms we are just learning to recognize and honor. And the next time you encounter an animal, any animal, consider the possibility that behind those eyes exists a being with internal experiences, with memories and preferences and reactions to the world that matter to them in ways we cannot fully imagine, but should respect nonetheless. Athena taught us that much. She deserves to be remembered, not just as a scientific subject or a research success story, but as an individual who lived, who survived, who recognized and remembered and communicated across boundaries that should have made connection impossible. Her life mattered. Her relationship with the human who saved her mattered. And the questions her existence raised about consciousness, cognition, and connection will continue mattering long after both octopus and marine biologists are gone, influencing how future generations of humans approach the remarkable, mysterious, conscious beings with whom we share this planet.